You're very like all American looking for being a podcaster. I always expect like, a fellow cave dweller.
I
What was
guess
I
I
gonna?
take it as a compliment. I'm very good looking, right? Like I'm very
Yeah, no, but like, big blonde swoop, and like, yeah. I was gonna say like either all American or like probably some other authoritarian 20th century regimes that would have you. I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. I know this one's coming out a little late, but I think you will enjoy it. Either that or it will totally infuriate you. But either way, I had a great time recording it. So, real quick, I do want to thank everybody who subscribes to The Secret Show. And if you like SLEERICKETS, if you would like to hear the second half of a lot of conversations or a lot of exclusive solo show stuff. I know some people really like solo shows. There are a lot of those on The Secret Show, along with conversations with some great people and plenty of everything else. Lately, I've been doing one a week, and I may try to stick with that. Thank you if you do subscribe, and if you don't, then go to sleerickets.substack.com and give it a try. If you put in your email address, I will give you a week's access for free, and you can see the 60 odd episodes that are up there now, along with new ones coming all the time. So, when I first started listening to poetry podcasts in earnest a few years ago, I found that there were really only like maybe 2.5 kinds. There were like standard interview shows, which with poets tended to be even less juicy than they were with novelists. Like often novelists would at least have some subject they were interested in, or they would tell part of the story of the novel, which had a story to it. The poetry interviews tended to be real dry, real dull. So there was the interview show, and there was the let me read a poem and then sigh and remark on how nice it is. And then in addition to that, there were some shows where people just read their own poetry. And, if occasionally one of those people was a genius, then that could be great. But for the most part, they weren't. Part of what has been really fun about doing this podcast for the last few years has been getting to know some more interesting poetry podcasts. Among them, some of my good friends and sometimes co-hosts, Alice Allen's shows, Poetry Says, is a sort of a funny combination of like sort of regular interviews and then bizarro audio art collages with a little bit of like heart-wrenching diary thrown in. There's Elijah's show, which is probably the most reliable of any poetry podcast, other than when he has us on. He does a sort of a serious background and analysis of a poem and focuses on meter, which is not something a lot of other people are doing. There's Matt Wall's podcast, which is like half pep talk, half furious barstool rant. There's Breaking Form, which is not my favorite, but is at least sort of interesting in its angle. And I have invited them on the show before, but they snubbed me, so don't say I didn't try. And then there's also, I learned recently from Matt Wall about Heavy Board, which is hands down, I forgot Ratbag Poetics. Though, David Matomet, if you're listening, let me know the deal. I would love to hear how that has been going. But as I said, Matt Wall introduced me to Heavy Board, which is definitely what wins the best show name award. Heavy Board obviously coming from the John Berryman poem, Dream Song, 14, something like that? Yeah, Dream Song 14. I'll be damned. I got it right. Heavy Board is hosted by Andrew Wittstadt, who is yet another disgruntled MFA in poetry. They do he has some friends and semi-regulars who do it with him, but he does both poetry and fiction, though I think his own background in writing is largely in poetry. He also does some sort of intra-show series on workshop life specifically. His show is irreverent, it is snappy, it is stylish, and it is entertaining. It's also very much its own thing. I think probably like the one stylistic criticism I have, Andrew, is we have different taste in cover art. But I have to say, for theme song, I mean, shit, you really blew us all out of the water. Like, theme song and title, you nailed it. Heavyboard is the kind of poetry podcast I sort of wished existed when I first started making this one. That is, it is frank, it is unguarded, and it is a little bit choleric, a little bit prickly. Now, part of Andrew's own angle on the whole poetry podcast question is politics. He does really get into politics. I, for the most part, don't on this show, mostly just because it's sort of beyond my grasp and understanding, and in most cases, interest. When I've mentioned that when I talk with Cameron, I sometimes feel like Winston Churchill. When I talk with Elijah, I feel like Allen Ginsberg. When I talk with Alice, I feel like the Tom Cruise character from Magnolia. And when I talked with Andrew, to my great surprise, I found myself feeling like Saira Rao screaming at a dining room table full of white ladies. But unlike Saira Rao, I had a great time doing it. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you will too. We were supposed to talk about this very smart essay called Capital Improvements by Marianne Corbett. It ran in Literary Matters, and it's all about initial caps, line initial caps, capitalizing the first letter at the beginning of a line of poetry. Marianne has a whole smart essay about this. The problem is I just sort of already agreed with everything she had to say, but I knew from listening to Andrew's podcast that he very much disagreed. So I asked him to read it, and I thought, well, let's just focus on that instead of getting into all of the controversial stuff. And then following my inerrant instincts, I immediately jumped into the controversial stuff. So we do ultimately get to Marianne's essay for part of the conversation in the middle, but then we sprawl way out from it on both ends. I always feel like I learn a lot when I talk with somebody I disagree with, and we did not even get to some of our most emphatic areas of agreement, including the awfulness of Sharon Olds' line breaks and the boringness of nature poetry. A completely uncontroversial opinion I'm sure nobody will be troubled by in any way. I don't know if you read that the newest issue of Poetry magazine has an editor's note where Mataika talks about kind of what he's been doing. And his friend says, oh, I had a conversation with a friend, and my friend said, I can't really like get your voice or your, stamp on it, but I do like what you've been publishing. And he said, oh, that's a triumph. Like, that's great. I want you not to be able to tell that it's me. And part of me was like, well, Adrian, like, that was your friend saying it's not good. Like, that was your friend trying to find a nice way to say it's not good. But also, like, I want it to be his thing. Like, whatever your magazine, whatever your show, like, I want to hear I want to hear your imprint. And so,
Right.
like, partly what I've really enjoyed with your show is even like numerous places where I like totally disagree with you, you're like frank and friendly and like, but also like willing to not necessarily pick fights, but like throw a couple bombs. And yeah, like it just feels like my feeling was like people care a whole lot about politics and they fight like cats and dogs over it, and like arguably too much at this point. but I wish there was even like a tenth of that kind of energy and fun in conversations about poetry.
Yeah, honestly, it's interesting. Well, thank you first of all, but yeah, there's a friend of mine, we were talking about this, and he was saying, it does feel like for like maybe like the last decade, maybe a little bit more, that there was like no place where you could just, even with groups of friends more recently, where like you could just sit around and just be honest and just talk about what you read or like a movie or anything. Because there's this thing that's creeping in. There's this thing that's like the source of all the tension with and even in friend groups, like you'll see this, and I don't want to overemphasize that either. I don't want to say that, oh, it's horrible and oppressive and blah blah blah, but it's real. And I think the reason people are drawn to podcasts such as these is that you can actually throw your opinions out there. Just, yeah, put your face and name out there, your opinion, and just stand by it if that's your honest take or opinion on it, and people respect it, because how else do you talk about this shit? How else do you talk about art with this, particularly poetry? And I guess we're just a poetry podcast, right? You guys just do poetry.
Well, it's nominally a poetry podcast. We end up doing a bunch of different stuff, but yeah, I mean that's kind of the star around which we elliptically orbit,
And that's how it always goes, right? Like podcast, it's vibes, man. It's just wherever the conversation goes, whatever comes up. Like if we're
Right,
having
yeah.
fun, people listening are having fun, like it's just kind of a hang. Like we
It's
go off on
it's a
some
social
tangent.
prosthesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it
Yeah,
has
definitely.
become one of those places where we can just give our thoughts and people will just listen to them and take them with a grain of salt if they want, whatever it is. Yeah. And it's just a lot of fun. So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
glad
funny.
to be on it.
In listening to like some of your, because it feels like, I mean, as is probably true with like any podcast that starts to have a little bit of meat on its bones, you have a few different running threads. Like if you have a few different hobby horses you return to. So like there is, I mean, I have not listened to your fiction episodes yet, but like you have these sort of fairly different modes you go into, and it's funny. Like you're probably your most cynical mode, which is, excuse me, I apologize. I'm coming down with something, so I'm going to be real coffee and phlegmy. But like your most cynical mode seems to be your DNC rubric hobby horse,
Right.
which it's funny. Like it's a feeling I often have when talking to like cynical friends. Is my feeling is like, oh, you're not being cynical enough. Like, like I mean, I think like like I would maybe just like in my like nitpicky brain, I would call it like a progressive heuristic that people like consciously and often not consciously
Right.
will like pick up a piece of art or pick up a comment or an essay, and they will sort of, one of the questions, and sometimes the primary question they will ask is like, is this doing good in the world according to a progressive outlook? And that may be, what statement is it making, who is it representing, and who is it associated with, and so forth. And like I don't think that's a nonsensical question to ask. I think like that's often a
Right.
meaningful question to ask. It is a little bit boring when it becomes the primary question that's asked, or the question that's asked sort of before, during, and after every other question. But like my cynicism is with like your use of the word anymore, because you'll say things like, oh, the people books aren't chosen for merit anymore, and I think like, no, it was always like, it wasn't always the way it is now. It was just
Think
a
I
different stupidity reigned at different times. Like
right.
every era has its own
Right.
dumb way of looking at things, and I think it's partly like, and this is where I am really interested. Like a lot of my background in my own work is in the like sub basement of the formalist poetry world, which is
Right.
like,
Yeah.
which has been out of favor since the last century and a half. So I think like
Right.
I'm my thought is like, well, today there's like a special awareness of progressive values that people put pressure on, and I think I think it can be sometimes useful, it can be often tiresome, but I think like go back 20 years and it's like it's a different, also largely arbitrary standard that people hold up to decide what
Right.
poetry is good and what's bad. I mean, flarf was like a major thing, what, 15-20 years ago. Like it's insane.
Right.
Like that didn't have to do with progressive politics. That just had to do with like a different dumb idea of what
Right.
poetry should be. So yeah, that's my only like real argument there is like, no, you're not being cynical enough.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. I am. Yeah. And even further back, I think a good comparison for now would be, yeah, like the Red Scare era of the 50s, kind of, where there is this kind of, and I do try to be careful. Well, I don't try to be that careful depending on the episode, but yeah, I'm perfectly willing to admit, yeah, like there are always things that are dumb that people are obsessed over that, are ruining or hurting our understanding of the work or even just appreciation of it and things like that. But I do emphasize that this one is a new one. This one is a new
Yeah,
one
yeah,
that cropped up in the last 8 years or so, and then it's hard to say exactly when. I'll never claim to know exactly when. It's a
but
cultural.
they're different markers. There's,
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin's death was a big one, and
Right.
Trump's
Yeah.
election was a big one, and George Floyd's death was another big one. That
And I think just
You know.
the prevalence of social media was a
Oh
huge part
God,
of it
yeah. I mean,
too.
just like
Yeah,
it's
like
been an
just
accelerant throughout.
right, yeah, just gasoline on stuff that was already brewing for decades, you know, in the culture, blah blah blah, milieu. And I always say, yeah, it's hard to point to like a single institution or like a single person or a single thing
Yeah,
when we're talking about an atmosphere,
yeah, of
like a
course, yeah.
cloud over everything, where there is this kind of the first question that is asked is how well does it adhere to, I always say, the DNC kind of ideology. And the reason I say that and not like something more general, like a progressive or a far left, is just because I try to get as specific as possible. And I also want to mock it. Like I do want to
Sure,
mock
yeah, yeah,
the
sure.
idea and I want to make it seem silly and kind of obsessed with this thing, this progressive politic thing. I want it to be made to look foolish, at least the best I can, you know,
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
ways. So, and I don't want to overemphasize it, you know, into the fucking social media world. If you say one thing, well, now there's all these things. They're like, well, you're just like a hard line, you know, this is some deeply
Yeah,
held
yeah, yeah,
belief you
yeah.
have, blah, blah. I'm like, well, no, but I am trying to point something out that I think is very real, you know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was trying to think about that in like in a sort of like oh shit, is it my dog being loud?
No, I didn't hear anything. You're good.
Oh, you don't hear it? Okay, so then
Oh, I heard
you're good.
that. Yeah, I
Yeah,
heard
all right,
that.
hold on a second.
I always say we'll include it in the recording, listeners here, while Matthew is tending to the animal. You know, these dogs. I like the dog in the background. You'll hear mine on my podcast. Little ambiance.
Sorry, yeah. Yeah, a squirrel runs by and she gets animated.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think like I was just trying to like ask myself as honestly as I could the other night, like, all right, so what effect has the political climate of the last several years had on me? And yeah, I mean, like I definitely in 2020 got peer pressured by some old fellow alums of my into like signing a petition that was basically saying like, oh well, if you don't change the names of these like horrible racist names of these buildings, then we won't come back to the university to do stuff for you. Which is like, well, they weren't asking, so like they weren't really
Right.
interested in having us back. Like the names of the buildings were racist assholes, who many of whom were like in the Klan, and so those should be changed.
Right.
But I don't know. I think often petitions have more to do with showing allegiance to something than with actually affecting any kind of change. And I have gotten like I've like felt like I'm walking on eggshells about some topics, but I think I also like probably take another moment to ask questions like, oh, when I like off the top of my head came up with this list of poets, did I bother to think about like, oh, are there some non like white guys there?
Right.
I think
Yeah.
like some of that has been to the good. And I'm like, my hope is like some bad influences have been purged, but I also think like a lot of noise and a lot of anguish and a lot of like meanness and petty bullying has also emerged out of it.
Right.
Again, I don't know how much more than in other times. I think like in some ways the petty bullying has shifted from right to left, and on the right there's more, we'll just pass this horrible law while you're not looking, rather
Right.
than, so I like I think I also have a certain liberty in just not being part of the academy. And so
Right.
when I talk to like a good friend of mine who's in the academy and says like, oh, you don't realize how much you're not affected by this stuff.
Right.
I can totally grant that. And I do like, I find, yeah, like I find, I think a lot of the conversations or like the pitch of conversations I hear in popular commentary to be really dreary, really tiresome, and I often just tune out of it for that reason. But yeah, like I think when it comes to like discussing poetry, I don't necessarily think of, say, the age of like Randall Jarrell and Robert Lowell as being a golden age, because I think there was a lot of other shit happening then that was
Right.
bad. But it does seem more fun. It does seem like it was a little
Yeah.
more fun, and that's partly what I'm hoping for with these podcasts, is just like to make it a little more fun. Certainly not make it, I mean, you couldn't get more contentious or backstabbing or petty than like Alan Tate tanking James Wright's career behind his back just because he didn't like him. So there's like, the shittiness and the cancellation and all that stuff that's going to appear in various forms. But I would love for us to be able to speak. I would just love for us to be able to speak frankly and have fun while
Right.
while making all of the same dumb mistakes all of our predecessors made.
Yeah, just the well, yeah, I mean the example is always that, like, yeah, I don't want to say that it's yeah, it is just another tool that you can use now to beat people over the head with. So like, for example, when you say, "Oh, I didn't like that book" or something, well, the very next thing somebody will say to you, if the author is, protect a certain group, so therefore a black poet or something like that, and then you say, "Well, I didn't really care for that book." Well, now you have to bat down political arguments that are going to come your way, right? So it's
Yeah.
not a poetic argument that they're going to make that says, "Oh, you don't like this." They're going to call you a racist. They're going to call you a witch. And then,
So
that's quite detrimental to be accused of that. Like,
totally, yeah,
it's very
totally.
real. Yeah.
I mean,
Your career could be over,
well,
could very well be over. Yeah.
yeah, and that's where like I do find I find like agitating for people to get fired to be really obnoxious, and I do, and like that's a again like unless you're like a trucker endangering people's lives or there's like some actual reason
It's,
that has to do with your job, like I don't, to me that feels a little bit offsides. But yeah, like partly I wonder like, well, where exactly is all this happening? Because I mean, I certainly will get notes from listeners saying like, "Oh, you didn't notice this thing because you're white," and I'll think like, "Well, all right, that's fair, like fair call. Like I could that can like let me
right.
take another look at it." But they are also generally pretty like decent and not like we're going to get you fired from your podcasting
Right.
self employment. I do wonder sometimes like, well, where is all this happening? And it seems like for you, a lot of it is. I mean, you're at a university, but it seems like a lot of it is also Twitter, which just boy, my like few month toe dip into that just convinced me it's an irredeemable pit of vipers. Like
Right.
I couldn't get out fast enough. But it, like I gather it also it provides some camaraderie among some other sets. But it just seems like that's a like how much of this is just fucking Twitter.
Uh, I would say I would go as far as to say almost all of it, and not just Twitter, but almost all of it is social media,
Yeah,
almost all
yeah.
of it. Because yeah, Twitter's the smaller user base, but there's caveats to that because almost everybody that has a prestigious position that writes for magazines and stuff is on Twitter daily. So that's like a disproportionate representation of this smaller user base than it is. But it's all over Facebook. I don't care. If you're on Facebook, you're getting this stuff. I mean, you hear about Facebook groups blow ups all the time. Like what was famously like the knitting community had like a huge blow up over, yeah, CRT and anti-racism kind of in the Kendi vein.
There's
And
also
that's
like a lot of
happening.
intense like toxic right wing stuff on
Yeah.
Facebook as well. I mean,
Oh,
there's
yeah, yeah. Well, that's
as
everywhere.
and on
Yeah, yeah,
Twitter, yeah, but yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's
Which it does
everywhere.
feel like a
Yeah,
lot of this is just people eating their own.
it is. And I always say yes. The right definitely is not innocent, especially if you go all the way back, especially the Red Scare era, where I like to compare today's the time we're living through now towards the time of the Red Scare. That was the Christian right that had a lot of power and
Mhm.
was at least culturally and was enforcing it. And that was a little different too, because it wasn't just kind of the everyday person, your neighbor and stuff doing it. It was like a government apparatus, like top down. So that's limited it a little bit. Now it's everywhere, so that you could be. We hear about the famous people that this happens to.
Yeah. You
And
don't
that's why I
hear
always
about the
just
people
say,
who just clam up because they're
right.
afraid to make it. Yeah.
And I mean, I witnessed it when I was an MFA, witnessed it happening. A teacher fired because they were accused of being too white and male, because that's something you can be accused of
So
now.
so is that when you say that though? Because it's not that I haven't heard about things in this vein, but like is that how specific are you being when you say that? Like presumably the petition or the post or the whatever didn't say he's too white and male. Presumably they said something else. So what like how like what are we talking about?
I mean, there was literally no other complaint. It was that he was mean and he was too white and male. He
Okay.
favored the white male perspective, were the exact words that were used as a complaint against him by a student.
Okay.
That launched the kind of, bureaucratic apparatus where you have to go through a process now if you have an official complaint launched. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's false. That's what I want to be clear about, is that we're pretending that this stuff is true. It wasn't true. This guy was not doing that. And I just want to be clear. And I know maybe some people in the audience would criticize me for that, but no, it's an exaggeration. I think what defines our time right now is hyperbolic hysteria, absolute hysteria. People are not being reasonable at all, about anything that happens. And we're
Mhm.
seeing the effects of it. We're seeing what happens when we go into absolute, and I think social media plays into this. So it does, you know, feed you things that are going to feed that outrage cycle.
Yeah.
And people are like, all right, it feeds outrage. Well, the algorithm doesn't give a fuck about outrage. It gives a fuck about clicks. But what gets clicks is people getting upset. That keeps people glued to the screen for hours if they're in, a back and
Oh, for
forth or
sure, for
something.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the social media companies all
Right.
for that. I wonder when it comes to like defining our time though, if I think like what defines our educated cultural conversational circles, then it may be like hysterical political outrage. When it defines like our time financially, it might be like monsters on Wall Street. When it defines our time like legally or politically, more like in terms of policy, it might look a lot more right wing. Like I feel like that's one of the arguments I hear back and forth among right wing and left wing people is, oh, the left wing is all in control. Oh, the right wing is all in control. I think, well, these are just
Right.
like different magisteria. Like they're different. Like both of those statements are right, but in different arenas. And it does seem like some of the complaints are, I think like there is, there is real racism and there is a real legacy of, unfair treatment in this country. I'm not convinced all of that is happening in its worst way on university campuses. And I
Right.
think I'm saying like there are places where it totally is happening, and it's not that it never happens on campuses, but it does seem like sometimes it's like the old Polish joke, like we look where the light is rather than where the problem is. Like I dropped my keys inside, but I'm going to go look under the street light because that's where I can see better.
And there's also like an overemphasis when they always use the kind of, they roll out the university campuses line of there's an overemphasis on basically like the Ivies, like the less than 1% of all colleges, like so where most people are not going to Ivy League schools,
of course.
yeah.
The argument that drove me most crazy was
yeah.
and like my part like part of my political outlook is like I want to hang out with people who are mostly artists and liberals, so I'll just basically vote with like fine. I don't know, but like fine, I'll vote for the DNC rubric when it comes to politics. But like the argument about the affirmative action case that drove me most crazy was that this matters because like we have to care about who gets into Ivy League colleges because that's where our elite comes from. Like, why?
Right.
Like stop doing that.
That's what I think there was a good point to be made about who made was it Lowry or somebody who McWhorter who made that point about how this really, when we're talking about cases like that and everybody was acting like it was the end of the world, again, kind of that hysteria over the ending of that policy. What it was really talking about was like, Fortune 500 companies, I guess, and like schools, like Ivies, and who, how many people are working for those companies and going to those schools? Not a whole lot, in the grand scheme of the population. So like,
but it occupies
people,
the lion's share of a certain kind of conversation, and so
and it's another tool, so you could use that for another argument about something. So, you could just hit somebody over the head with it or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like I'm not a fan of Insta poetry, and like, I'm not, and I'm not really a fan of most spoken word, and I love Matt Wall, but like much of the poetry he's really into is not my cup of tea. But I kind of enjoy, again, like partly as a like a formalist outsider, I kind of enjoy the expansion of the arena of poetic conversation beyond those campuses, so that maybe some of it is like dum-dums on Instagram talking about poetry in dumb ways, or like this sweet, I mean, my heart went out to the sweet college kid I like quoted recently who like had only heard of she was like, free verse was, ever since free verses was invented 10 years ago. And you're like, fine, like, all right, cool. Like, but like even just having the conversation expand to include more people, not all of whom go to Ivy League schools, like I think that's probably not a bad thing. And it probably will, again, make it more fun.
My only issue with, like I'm never going to tell people not to read or not to be creative or to even find, because you look at some, especially the spoken word stuff, I think it had a big revival, like when I guess when YouTube's heyday, like kind of 2012-ish, 2013, started having a huge revival, like the button poetry stuff. And
button poetry?
I mean, I don't really follow it, but I mean, just like the channels on YouTube that put up the spoken word stuff, people performance. And I think that is more performance than it is poetry. That's more like monologuing. I think a lot of that, and people confuse it, but still, I'm not going to fault anybody for doing that. But what I will fault people on is having taste. I mean, like that's like the big, like, So if there somebody shows me something like, oh, this is really good, this is really good, and I'll look at it, it's like a spoken word. I'm like, okay, not listening to your opinion on any of this. Okay, next. And I think that it speaks to a crisis of authority too. Like there is a crisis of nobody wants to be authoritative about what they think. Nobody has enough confidence in their own opinion, their own aesthetic, their own
I don't
taste.
know if that's nobody. I think like there are a lot of people say like
Well, if you do,
making authoritative claims. It may be that
sure.
there's no consensus about authority,
Well,
right?
sure, but I just mean like in terms of like if you're going to make a stand and you're going to take a stand that particularly doesn't follow that DNC rubric that I talk about, whereas yeah, you have to adhere to this kind of political ideology and that's what makes it good. If you're not going to say that and with authority,
Yeah.
you have to be prepared to be hit over the head. Like it's going to come for you. People are going to be upset. I guess back in the day
Oh,
there was even back in the day, like people writing book reviews for the magazines and things, like they talk about like the hate mail they would get, if you like reviewed a
yeah.
book poorly like in the Atlantic 30-40 years ago, you'd get
Right.
all this hate mail from the fans, or it's
Sure.
always the case. But then
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
social
Yeah.
media has just we just have this extra layer now, like it's everywhere at all times. It's just the
Yeah.
backdrop to everything.
Yeah. And there is a because the conversation is more democratized, which is has a lot of really great benefits. It also then allows for more crowd behavior, more like this seems to be the done thing, and so I'll
Right.
come along to do this because I will do what's the done thing.
Yeah, and I think you see instances where people do have that kind of enough courage to just say, no, this is my opinion and this is my taste, and we're not budging. When you see that happen, it does go away, right? So I think people are just get really scared. And I mean, look, I've been on the bottom of online pylons. I know how that feels. Okay, like
Sure.
it feels like the world is collapsing around you and everything's over, your life's over, you're waiting for an email or a call from your boss or whatever. But I think that's kind of a false, it makes you do feel it and the feelings are real because you're on social media, but it is kind of a step removed from the real world, but it doesn't feel that way.
Mm.
So if you just kind of stand firm, I mean, it depends what you're saying. It depends what you're saying, of
Yeah,
course. But like if
yeah,
you just stand firm, like an opinion on a poem or something is not a big deal. It does go
yeah.
away.
Right.
And you see this with publishers, even when the junior staffers revolt. When you see the senior editors or something just say, no, we're going to stick with this, it kind of goes away within like 24 hours. It's kind of over. But if you start to capitulate to the kind of book crowd that's insisting you not publish this book or insisting you cancel this contract or whatever, then it could last months, if you keep giving in to these constant demands where like, you don't actually have to do that. And I
Yeah.
think that's why it's weird, right? And I know it's weird to say it. Like to me, make a claim like this, it's hard to make a definitive claim about it because it is up to like the crowd mentality and then these individuals in these certain positions that could stand up to the crowd. And it's
Yeah.
just a matter of who's
So
got the
I
balls
yeah,
to do it.
I mean that's there's truth to that, but I also feel like aren't there like a lot of people making arguments like this now? And I mean, it's certainly like
Sure.
I wonder, like I get driven crazy by the conservative Christian poetry establishment making their authority, I mean, which like I wouldn't normally have a lot to do with, except that like I have friends who are part of that,
Really?
and I also write formal poems, and like not a lot of people have any interest in that, and so one of the few groups that tends to have some sort of perennial interest in formal poetry is the conservative Christian crowd. And
Ooh.
so I end up hearing about it and listening to that and reading James Matthew Wilson, who will say plenty of smart things and a handful of infuriating things. And I don't know, like I'm not sure that I think so much of this may be a matter of siloing. Like it may be a matter of like in this particular arena, in this particular profession, or this like company or school, nobody is saying like, I mean, I think that may
Right.
be it, is like within any given arena you're going to have one view hold sway, and people are going to
Right.
feel a lot of pressure to go along with that. But I don't know that it's quite as homogeneous one might suggest, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
and that's what makes it tricky, I think,
Yeah.
because it isn't like, yeah. And I mean, I think this is an effect of social media too, is the fact that everything is siloed off into these kind of
Yeah.
factions within a larger community. So even if you just take something like poetry, you can hear about one whatever clique of people that are doing something in poetry, and then you won't hear about 10 other ones, but they're all there. They're all there for anybody to see if you make the effort to look for it.
Yeah.
but we're
It's
all
funny.
fractured in that sense. Yeah.
You've said a couple times, because I know you sometimes will have anonymous Twitter people on your podcast. You'll say on our side of Twitter, and I never. But the thing is, like, I don't even know what that means. Like,
Right.
what is that? What's our side of Twitter?
Well,
It's
just
not
like
even, it
the
seems
kind
like it's not
of
even a site. It's like our like fractal, portion of
right.
Twitter. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's essentially what I mean. Yeah, like our little kind of faction where it's very kind of strange, especially with the position that I'm in. And even then, like when I have the people that want to remain anonymous, um, they're maybe even in like different factions than I'm in, but I see them, they'll pass by or whatever. And a lot of times I'm usually having people on that I've either had conversations with before or have been talking to, or I just know
Oh
that they're
yeah, yeah,
fans
yeah.
of
I'm not
the
suggesting that they're
genre
totally
and
anonymous to you. I just meant that like
right.
they're like I will like you'll have their Twitter handle will be what's listed, but I
Right.
just yeah I'm out of the Twitter loop, but I also I think like this is like one of my pet theories for like philosophical conversations and critical conversations across the ages is that like 90% of the disagreements stem from a misunderstanding about what goes without saying. Like you come in with a set of givens, like, well, of course, all of these things that go without saying in my milieu, but then somebody else from like 2 blocks down reads you and says, like, what? How could you possibly have failed to mention this? Which is just one of your givens. So I always wonder, like, well, what are your givens exactly?
For
Well, I don't know. For like, I mean, is Twitter for you? Is Twitter mostly politics for you? Is it mostly poetry? Is it mostly just social?
It's mostly social, although I do follow probably a disproportionate amount of politics to most people.
Okay,
I like to follow. There's writers and commentary people that I like to follow, but then there's just also people that I like that are more cultural stuff. I like art, I like movies. I follow a lot of movie
sure,
stuff.
sure, sure, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I do use it. I try to view it more as like a networking thing now, whereas that's what I'm trying to use it for, is to just be networking, get people to come on my podcast, or people will ask me on theirs or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that, to just because everything's so DIY. Yeah, just use it in
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
sense. I do. Yeah. I mean, there is,
It's like using
communities for
Facebook for the
anything.
baby pictures.
Yeah. 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 And people use Facebook for the same thing. You have a couple groups that you're always running around and
Sure.
you start to become friends with these people. So
Yeah, yeah,
it is a very weird new way of communicating that we're all
yeah.
kind of rolling around in.
Yeah,
But
particularly post pandemic, where like
yeah,
half of
yeah,
all
yeah.
conversations are virtual anyway.
And the fact that we're always communicating through text now too, I think merely changed the
Yeah, yeah,
game.
yeah.
Like
Without tone, without facial expression, without
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
pause, has the timing and
You can't
cadence
even
and
tell if it's a joke sometimes,
right,
if
right, right.
somebody's
Yeah.
making a comment or so. Yeah, like so that does it. And I don't know. I mean, yeah.
It is one of the I think advantages of podcasts is the ability to provide context. Human
Oh yeah.
context, tonal context, a sense of moving from one part of the conversation to another, which is why the increasingly widespread practice of text quoting podcasts out of context is just such a disappointment. Like, come on,
Yeah.
come on. If you
I
quote a
have come
podcast, you
to
should have to quote like 30-minute chunks of it at a time.
yeah. I have come to kind of accept that as inevitable,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah, sure.
people are going to say what they're going to say, and
Yeah, yeah,
I can't let them change my tune on something, even though sometimes they'll try hard, but no, like yeah, I mean, what can you do? It's just part of, yeah, having, if you're going to put this out there, well, expect to people to push back because they're going to like
yeah.
like,
But yeah,
and
part
if
of
you
me,
can't handle
yeah,
that, it's rough. Yeah, that's rough sometimes. Yeah.
maybe like having been very disliked for most of my life, I was telling Matt Wall the other day that like it only occurred to me recently when I mentioned this to my wife that it was like, oh, that's maybe an unusual experience. But I used to have to wait around after school to get picked up, and it was like freshman year, sophomore year, and I would pick up litter, and I picked up this piece of paper like sitting around my high school campus, and it was a unmistakable caricature of me with devil horns, just like that I randomly picked up off the ground. And my thought when I picked it up was like, oh, well, naturally, like of course. But I think like there is I think people aren't used to being disliked, and so there is a lot of pressure, no matter what circle you are in, to do what people are doing, that to follow the crowd. And I mean,
Right.
again, like I understand that, and in certain ways I do that. Like what's the Jefferson line in matters of fashion swim with the current, in matters of principle stand like a rock. And like part of it is like, where do you distinguish between the current and, or, you know, the principle and fashion? And I think like for me, politics is largely fashion. Like, all right, man, like cool.
Yeah.
I have some genuine feelings, and I have some, I'm not a total idiot, and I have some sense of compassion and things, and that, but like largely I think like, all right, the people I know and care about are liberals. Like I'll go with the, like, fine, like that's
Right.
cool. But I forget how much people don't want to be disliked.
And I don't even think it's so much that people want to be, or yeah, you know, it's not like we want to be disliked. It's just
No,
that, you
no,
know,
no,
if
no.
you're okay with,
You don't
yeah,
actively want to be disliked. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
but you
Maybe
can handle
some
a little bit.
some
Yeah,
freaks out there do, maybe.
yeah.
Some
The
freaks get
GG
off on
Allens
the,
of Twitter. Yeah.
yeah, there's some, I mean, that's a serious thing too. Like that's a new
Oh
psychological
God,
thing.
yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
people
The
get
troll
off on the
thing.
hate,
Yeah,
like they do. And it's,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
guess I could see how it could come sometimes be fun, but like, no thanks.
All right, so I did want to. I initially asked you on, no pun intended, to talk about this Marion Corbett piece. Marion Corbett's an excellent poet and a in critic, and really just like one of the most like lovely and consistently decent like poetry world citizens, where she like pays attention to other people's work. She writes reviews. She writes essays about things. She you know makes links you know across different groups, and is just sort of like a she's like a well-adjusted thoughtful lover of poetry in the world, which is somebody I use, the sort of person I always admire and can never totally be myself. But she wrote this piece in Literary Matters recently called Capital Improvements, the Initial Caps Wars. And it's about a topic like I only vaguely have thought about recently, but I read her piece and then I listened to your spiel on Charles Simic, which was wonderful in part because I really appreciated that you sort of you said like a couple things are true at once. Like he's written some really wonderful poems and he's fallen off. And like maybe
Right.
that's inevitable, and maybe like maybe people just fall off when they get older, but it would be in a way disrespectful to his earlier work to pretend that this was up to that standard. And you
Right.
had various things to say about the book and about other things he'd written, but one of the things you really got caught on was his use of initial caps. So people understand what this is. Would you explain what that is and what your thought your feelings were on that?
For just Simics.
Yeah, or just like when we, because I think some people listening to this might not understand what we mean when we talk about you know line initial caps, or however you how does she put it yeah, line initial caps in poetry.
Yeah, so basically just like every first line, the first letter of every line is capitalized
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
for people. Yeah, I mean, my view on it for Simic, the same reason that I would probably, when we get into this piece here, the same reason. The reason I would say that I didn't like his use of it in that book, or just aesthetic choice. What I see, like the big thing I see in the piece overall too, and like the Corbett piece, you know, there's no mention of a sentence, or I guess syntax is mentioned twice in the piece, but not really beyond, just kind of
Yeah.
mentioning it. And then no mention of aesthetic or anything like that. So it just personal like aesthetic for me. Uh, it's always the kind of the way it butchered the sentences for his, like just meat cleaver right in the middle of them, basically.
Yeah, she has a case about whether or not, and she, you know, to be clear, she writes formal poetry, but she also does not use line initial caps. But
Right.
uh she does make an argument about how like it you can either say that it does or does not interrupt the meter. But that was in a way like I found that to be kind of a curious angle to take, because at least for formal poets, it's not really interrupting the meter because it's a new unit of meter with every line that has a cap. So in a way, like it's consistent with the meter. What you could argue that it does interrupt is the grammar, or the you know it interrupts the sentence if there's any kind of
Right.
enjambment. So that I think is an argument she just doesn't take on, and that's sort of one of the things that bothers you about it, is it breaks up the sense of the sentence.
That, and I think just like the natural rhythm too, because again, yeah, I don't think Simic is using it for meter in that case, you know, like I
No, I
think,
think he's
and
pretty
it could be
flourish.
that he just, yeah, aesthetically likes it, and that's fine. You're allowed to
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that
yeah.
shit, you
Sure,
know,
sure, sure.
like,
Yeah,
yeah. But yeah, I think in his case, maybe it was tradition. I don't know. Maybe it was just his habit. Maybe it was just, I kept trying to find a reason, especially in
yeah,
that
yeah,
book.
yeah,
Like I
yeah.
kept trying to find, okay, why would somebody do this? Why would somebody choose this? And I think Corbett in this piece, you know, she goes into a nice kind of historical summary in the beginning there about kind of the evolution. I will say she didn't mention the novel and its effect on poetry, particularly in the 20th century. But yeah, I think
Would
that for
you,
the most part.
how would you, how do you see the novel's influence on poetry as affecting this question? Or like
I
typographical questions?
Right. Like I see because the popularity of the novel came in, I guess we fairly late 1700s into the 1800s is when the novel's popularity. And then in the kind of the 20th century, we had the pop novel, which really blew up, you know, and people could make lots of money off their, you know, kind of sci-fi or crime books or whatever it is. And even literary, you know, if you're blending the genres or something. But yeah, I think that made a huge impact on how people not only print, but write and participate in poetry. Whereas poetry got put on the back burner when the novel usurped literature as like the pinnacle thing of literature, particularly in the 20th century.
Do you think that
So
like, so do you think in terms of the typography of poetry that there was a, did you see the typography of poetry beginning to imitate that of novels or trying to distinguish itself more crisply, or like
probably
what's that
both.
influence? Okay, yeah,
I would say, but and you know, like we said, faction. There's always going to be both. So there's going to be
sure.
people reacting to it, against it, trying to go more traditional, and there's going to be people embracing it and evolving, kind of. And I mean, it's always interesting, yeah, how language evolves, how all of that evolves, and kind of the traditions evolve too, which I think is always, yeah, worth talking about and going into. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and a question both you and Marianne brought up in slightly different directions was the is the Microsoft Word question, which like I mean truly like way back when I was sort of, they talk about like your 18 to 24-year-old demographic is when you like, this is the peanut butter I'm going to use for the rest of my life. And when I made that choice for word processors, truly the reason I went with Apple is that they didn't make formatting choices. They didn't impose formatting choices on you. Like
Right.
Microsoft
Right.
Word, if you hit return before letting the line go to the end of into the page, it will automatically capitalize a letter. And I think like probably lots of people falsely get accused of capitalizing their
Right.
first letters for that reason. But I think also probably a lot of people do capitalize their first letters for that
Right.
reason because it just
Right.
happens automatically. And so like the thing that I find sort of fascinating and wonderful about all this is that like I do have like fairly specific guidelines for how I do this and reasons for and like most of my poems I use line initial caps, though I don't when I write mostly in meter and rhyme, not always rhyme but in meter. And then in some poems in recent years what I've done is I'll write the poem out in meter and then I will re-break the lines to make it not look like it's in meter. And when I do that, I will take off the line initial cap. So if it's sort of presented in what looks like free verse and what is not actually a metrical unit, I'll take those caps off. I have previously, so this is like listening to your monologue or your rant or whatever you call it, like actually opened my eyes a little bit because I found that when I send out to magazines, it is easier to get a poem published if it doesn't look like it's written in meter. Like
Right.
if it looks like free verse, it's easier to get it published. But now I'm wondering if that had as much to do with taking the caps off. And because I think like it just
Yeah. I
hadn't
mean,
occurred to me that people have such strong feelings about it until listening to you and thinking like, oh gosh, I guess like there are people for whom this is like, or like the Simon Armitage line about like bolt, which is a pretty good line. He says like using line initial caps is like bolting a fire escape to the side of like a beautiful building. So like
right.
in a way, like I can understand how people would have strong feelings, but I think it just didn't like you're in a way you're like a everybody feels like an outsider. I mean like like you have your own way of being an outsider, but in some ways I feel like you're more in the know when it comes to the house style of American poetry today.
Hmm.
So it's just like this. I was really curious, but like, well, so help us out. Like, give us tell us what the how do cool people see this stuff? How should we understand this stuff?
I can only really speak for my own, preferences in terms of aesthetic and craft, but I see what you're saying. Yeah, like there will be a rejection of meter, and even if you're not obviously doing the rhyme at the end to really bring that meter home to somebody. One, I would say most editors at these magazines, they're 20 something college students, like probably volunteer.
Yeah.
I don't think they even notice if you're writing in meter
Well, I was
or
gonna say
initial
if you
caps.
don't
Yeah.
rhyme, then they won't notice.
Right.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
very seldom will notice if you don't rhyme. So if you
And
even like if you just break it so that the rhymes don't come at the end of the line, then they usually will. They'll say, "Oh, that's internal rhyme." Which internal rhyme is good. End rhyme is bad.
right.
Yeah.
And I don't like to beat up literary journals too much because I do understand, like those are labors of love. They're
Yeah. Yeah.
not making money, and they actually lose money most of the time, when
Totally.
they put
Totally.
them
Yeah.
out, and they are, and they're the ones that are still around, the ones that haven't folded are the ones that are supported by universities. So, you have young people, students of the craft,
Or pharmaceutical money.
yeah, right.
In
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Poetry
Yeah. Yeah.
Foundation. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, why would you, what is your usually like reason for putting them in there? Is it like just aesthetically pleasing, or you like that it demarcates or like gives that little, because I think there is a way you could use initial caps to the poem's advantage. But of course, my response to that would be like, well, it depends on the poem, right?
Yeah.
Like if
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
having that nice rigid side there. And like I said, it does kind of, my bigger complaint, not so much the way it looks on the page with the rigid, kind of fire escape
Sure.
style on
Sure.
the side, is more so, yeah, that it's kind of like a meat cleaver if you have a sentence that isn't jammed and going through to the
Right.
next,
Right.
like a kind of like a meat cleaver in the middle of the sentence.
Yeah.
But that's just a aesthetic preference for me. So yeah. What would you
Yeah.
say is
Oh, I mean, for
draws you
me,
to it, or what it does for
yeah.
your work, or
I mean, mostly it's, I mean, I'll say it's a matter of how, because I think there are actually like several questions like this where I think you and I have like opposing instincts, but I also can understand the argument. So I mean, for me, it's largely a matter of habit. I do think of the capital letter at the beginning of the line indicating a new unit of meter. So it's not a new unit of sentence, right? It's a new unit of
right,
meter, and the punctuation marks, which like I also drives me crazy when people inconsistently take out punctuation, especially if they like sometimes expect the line to do the work of the punctuation. I
right,
just like there's like punctuation has its value. Punctuation is can
right,
be helpful. That's the grammatical version of this. That tells us where the sentence
right,
ends, or where the pauses in the sentence are grammatically, and then the line break and the cap tell us where the metrical unit is. I also, though, like that's my feeling about, like I think there's like a specific value to stanzas, there's a specific value to indentation, to line breaks, to all these things in on the page. Like I think all of those things
right,
correspond to events happening in sound. But I also,
right,
like, partly for that reason, I tend to like, I have a specific opinion when it comes to my own work, but then I also think like, well, but the typography isn't really real. Like the typography doesn't really matter because the actual poem is all sonic. So I think of I think of the typography as being almost like sheet music, and like looking at different anthologies and looking at different works over the centuries, you see like a lot of that stuff's going to get jumbled. Like a lot of that stuff's going to get reproduced differently in some other format, and so it's for the same reason that I think like when it comes to line initial caps, when it comes to honestly like well, this is the big one, but like I almost feel like line breaks. This is like one of my co-hosts argues with me about this. He says line breaks in formal poetry are arbitrary, and I tend to say line breaks in free verse are arbitrary. Like it sort of doesn't matter, man.
yeah,
Like whatever, because there's no metrical unit. But I tend to think like you have another argument about breaking poems and breaking books of poems into sections,
yeah,
and like
yeah,
you're completely right that like those sections, those like 1, 2, 3, 4, those are usually largely arbitrary. They don't
yeah,
really indicate any kind of new unit. They're just there to kind of provide some pleasant spacing. It's funny, like I use them. Like in my first book, I have them, and in my second book that's going to be coming out, I also have them. And I'm totally with you. I totally agree with all of your arguments about them. It's just that like I have found that it's kind of nice to have a little air, to have a little breath to take. Like it's like when my brother said like, oh well, the biggest difference between this bourbon and that bourbon is that bottle looks nicer. So why would you buy
right,
that one? And I said, well, because the bottle looks nicer. Because like I like having that bottle on my table and it looks
right,
nicer. Like
yeah,
so I feel like you're totally right. Like the unit break is arbitrary, but like it's kind of nice to take a breath there. And I feel like when I'm reading a book of poems, sometimes it can be nice to like, oh, okay, got to the end of section one. And it
right,
doesn't really mean anything. But I also think like the poetry collection as a unit is sort of meaningless. Like it lasts for like a couple years. And then if those poems have any life after that, it's because they get blasted out and anthologized.
yeah,
So like the poetry collection is a very like fragile temporary unit in my mind. So
Right.
I like a lot of those formatting kind of changes or formatting choices. It's interesting. Like my impulses are away from yours, but I also tend to think like, oh, but that's because they don't matter, man. Like, just let it go.
Right.
But yeah, like but I think like I can understand, particularly coming from a free verse perspective, how like some of the stuff could drive you crazy because it is basically just convention.
Yeah. I think it's convention, and like there's also, I think there are reasons for it. Like for line breaks, most of the time when I'm harsh on them, especially if it's not meter, it's because there's a natural flow, and the way you use punctuation to help the reader understand how you want this thing to go, the rhythm to it, you also can use those lines. And I think there's an argument for initial caps you could be used for that too, particularly if you're messing around with kind of floating lines and things. I think that could be interesting. But yeah, I think it's mostly like the people that are arbitrary line breaks, or and even with the arbitrary kind of sections in books, I think there's a way to use that where it actually really complements the kind of process of reading the book, like you're saying, either with like thematic changes, or I guess the example that's sticking out in my head is like Bridget Pegan Kelly's The Orchard, which we did on my podcast very early on, one of the first episodes, but is like I think she used that actually really well, where there you could actually feel the changes in between the sections, and as she separated them out. Maybe she used one or two too many, but I still think like, okay, I could see that being like a useful tool for a whole collection. And yeah, I mean, there's reasons for everything, but I always say eventually at a certain point, it does just become aesthetic preference, because this is the best part about talking about art, is that everybody wants to make these kind of like philosophical arguments, or like these, well, this is the answer, this is the way it should be. When in reality, it's all about kind of aesthetic, I think, is the most important part. Like, how is it being used on the page? How is this like, does it all work in tandem? And that's why I would probably get on somebody like Simic, where I would say that like the initial line caps are not working in tandem with everything else on the page. They're actually distracting from it. Although I wouldn't say they were terribly distracting in his case, because everything else was so simple. But
There's often like only like 2.5 words per line anyway. So
right, yeah,
like,
exactly, yeah.
So that was the first part of my conversation with Andrew. There's another hour still of edited down tape. I think it went to some pretty juicy and interesting places. If you would like to hear that, then go to SLEERICKETS.substack.com and check out The Secret Show. It should be up there in a couple of days. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you again to Andrew. Go check out Heavy Board. It's on all the usual podcast places, and I put links in the show notes as always. You can reach me at sleerickets@gmail.com, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.